Ladies and gentlemen, it is time to hold the power of UE5 in the palm of your hand. Let's get to it. Hey guys, welcome to today's episode, and I am really excited for today's episode because we are finally setting up our very first gameplay ability of our game. And this is the first of many episodes on gameplay abilities, because really it's just the tip of the iceberg on how we want our game to play. The real question of every game is, what will the player actually do in the game? How will the game mechanics actually work? So for this very first ability, I'm envisioning this sort of like as a Human Torch ability. So inevitably the player's running into dark places in the game needs a way to be able to see what's going on. So they light a fire directly in their hand and they can see that all around. So it's nothing that's yet doing damage or affecting enemies or affecting the world, but we will get there in the due course of time. We're just starting out simple for our very first ability. So there are really three pieces to setting this up. So number one is activating and deactivating the ability. So how do we turn on the ability? How do we turn it off? Then comes the effect of the ability. So what is it actually going to do? And the last piece is the animation of the character tied to the ability. So we're going to cover the start of all three today. And in the last couple of episodes, we covered Niagara first, because inevitably in any gameplay ability, almost always you're going to have some sort of effect. And also in previous episodes, we already covered stuff like how to activate or deactivate something like our walk run toggle. That's in episode 4. So the last piece that we have yet to cover in this series is animation. And we're not starting by bringing in a brand new animation. That's going to be 2 episodes from now. Because in this particular ability, they could have their hand kind of up in the air when they're doing other things, like they're walking or running, or they're jumping, or they're just standing still. And so what we really need to do is we need to modify existing animations in some way. So what we're going to do today is we're only going to have to adjust 2 bones in the player's skeleton. Basically their upper arm and their forearm. And we can adjust the position of those without affecting the rest of the animations going on for our character. So there's a lot of new concepts that we're covering today. If you've already watched the previous 2 episodes on Niagara, then you're already going to be familiar with a lot of the effects that we're doing, so that's going to be easy. But we're diving for the first time into animation. All the stuff involving bones, sockets, the player's skeleton, you're going to get an overview of all of that. Really, this episode is intended as an intro to animation in Unreal Engine 5. So let's get to it. So the very first thing we need to do to get this party started is we got to activate the brand new UE5 Niagara Fluids plugin. So if you go up to settings and then plugins, and we just search for Niagara Fluids, and then you activate that, we're going to need to restart the engine and you're all set to go. So the Niagara Fluids plugin, it's really a lot more than just fluids, because it's gases, it's other substances like fire. Really, it's any sort of amorphous substance. And it's really versatile because the way Unreal Engine designed it is they designed 2D and 3D effects. Now the 2D effects, they still look kind of 3D because they face the camera. And in fact, that's what we're going to use today. I experimented with a 3D effect as well, and it looks a little bit better potentially. But the problem is that the 3D effects are much more performance intensive. So unless you're rendering them as cinematics, it's probably not going to work to have a lot of effects in your game. So to start out, let's navigate to our content drawer. In the last couple of episodes, I created this folder for Niagara, and I'm just going to create a new folder here for gameplay abilities. And then we'll go into that, and I'll create another new folder for aptly titled Fire. And I'm going to go ahead and give that a new color just so that it's more fiery, let's say. Something like that. There we go. And if I go into Fire, here's where we're going to create a new Niagara system. And now to use the fluids, you got to choose New System from a template or behavior example. And we'll do Next. And then we have this entire list. So we have liquids, we have gases, 2Ds to start, and then 3D. And you could try all these out, but they're much more performance intensive if you go into the 3D stuff. And for this very first ability we're making, I'm sticking with this grid 2D gas moving fire. So Finish. And I'm going to title this Torchlight _ NS for Niagara System. We'll double click to go into that. Now these new fluid emitters, they're really complicated. So basically the source particles communicate into the smoke fire emitter, and if you expand this, it is huge. It's got a ton of stuff going on here. Yeah, it just goes and goes and goes. So let's not expand it. But luckily, most of the things, pretty much everything that I had to change, I found in the emitter summary here. And so what Unreal Engine does with that is they take all the most important features and they stick them in the emitter summary, and then we have kind of an abbreviated list of the things that we might want to change in the emitter. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go through all the settings in the system here just to get the right feel, the right shape of the fire so that it's ready to tie it to the animation. So if we navigate on the left side, source particles to the spawn rate, I'm just going to adjust this to be a little bit less than what it currently is, so 300. The next thing is under initialize particle. I'm just going to standardize the lifetime to be 0.3. And then to get this fire actually pointed upwards, we're going to enable this add velocity and cone here. And when we do that, we see it kind of shooting outwards. If we wanted to do a flamethrower, maybe we could start with that. But I'm going to navigate to add velocity and cone. So the minimum is going to be 0, and the maximum, instead of 1800, is just going to be 200. And then I also changed this velocity distribution along cone axis to be a higher number, like 0.8. And if you see here, it says that higher numbers increase the likelihood of receiving velocity closer to the cone axis. So that's upward. And the cone axis is upward based on the z that's here. One thing is, if you wanted the direction to be able to be changed based on the orientation of the system in the world, like if I turn the fire in the world, then instead of the cone axis coordinate space being world here, I would set it to local, because the z-axis of the system would then be this way if I turn the system that way. But because this is set to world, any direction that I turn the fire, z is still going to be upward because it's oriented by the world axis. Now, we're going to change this fire to be a lot less wide. We're going to bring it in so that it originates in a very small space, right around the hand. So to do that, I'll go to sphere location. Instead of a radius of 50, I'm going to make this absolutely tiny, so 2. And you see now that the origination of the fire is happening in that very small space, like right there. But the problem is that it's spinning all around, so what's controlling that? So that's the curl noise force here. We're just going to tone that down quite a bit. So the strength I'm going to bring from 130 all the way down to 0.1. And you see now basically it's straight up. There's still some curl noise, but not much. And then the noise frequency I'm going to set to 0.05. So now we see the effect. It's still curling a little bit, but it's toned down quite a bit. Mainly it's just straight up. Now we got 2 settings we also got to modify under the grid 2D gas smoke fire emitter here. And remember, we can go right to emitter summary. We can get all the most important stuff. If we scroll down a little bit, we got to get to this solver, dissipation density and dissipation temperature. So the dissipation density, this controls how much smoke there is. So if I make this a very small number, 0.2, so it doesn't dissipate nearly as fast, and then the smoke just lingers and lingers and lingers. So if you want a really smoky fire, that's what we can do. But I'm going to up this quite a bit just so that there's a lot less smoke. So 10. And then for the dissipation temperature, the greater this is, the less fire and the more smoke. So if I make this like 100, then there's a lot more smoke and there's less fire. So basically dissipation density controls the overall effect. So the smaller that is, the more general of an effect you're going to have. And in the dissipation temperature, if you up that, that's going to shrink the percentage of the effect that's fire versus smoke. So I'll give you an extreme example here. So let's say the dissipation density is 100, so it's a very big effect. And then the dissipation temperature, I'll set that to 2. So that's almost entirely fire, right? So it's got long, thin strands of fire that goes up. Doesn't really look realistic. But if I up this to something like 1,000, it's going to be all smoke. Yeah, so there we go. So I see our smoke there, and I could actually dissipation density set this down to like 2. And then, then there's just smoke, 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 smoke. So yeah, I'm going to revert that back to about 10 by 10, and that's going to give the torchlight effect that I really want. All right, so we are all set with the Niagara system. I'm going to save, and we'll close out of this. So now, the next step is figuring out where this Niagara system is physically going to be attached on our character. And at the beginning of this episode, you saw it was like right on their hand. So how do we attach it there? So for that, I'm going to use what's called a socket. So the first thing you should do is navigate to your animation blueprint. So for me, it's under content_core because we sorted this in episode 3. So sockets are a way of specifying on the character's skeleton where do we want something attached, or a series of things attached. And we haven't talked about skeletons before, but every single character in Unreal Engine is animated with something called a skeleton. And you can access your mannequin's skeleton, really any character's skeleton, by going up here in the top right corner and looking for the skeleton icon. And skeletons in Unreal Engine are made up of what are called bones, and each bone is attached to a specific location on that character. And based on the rotation, the orientation of each bone, that controls how our character is moving at any moment in time on an animation. We are going to do a little bit of manipulation of 2 bones later in this episode, but for now we're just setting up the socket. So if you scroll down on the left-hand side looking through all the skeleton's bones till we get to the right arm, right about here. So it starts with the clavicle right, upper arm right, lower arm right, hand right. And the reason we're starting there is because that's where we're attaching the fire to the player's right hand. And if you select hand R, right click and say add a socket. And that appears all the way at the bottom here because what's also attached to the hand are all the fingers here. And the socket has its own icon and it's titled hand_R socket. And the thing that I want to show you, if we readjust our camera speed to something a little bit lower, we can get in very close and we can actually adjust the location of that socket. So if you select the select and translate here, and we can put that, let's do that more kind of directly in the palm of the player's hand. And by the way, this is also exactly how you'd attach something like a sword or a bow and arrow or a gun to a player's hand. So I'm going to position this socket as close to the middle of the hand as I can, but a little bit out, because anything that the player is manipulating in space with their hand, it's not going to be directly on the hand, it'll be a little bit removed from it. And we can always come back in and change that if we want to change the position, but that looks good to me. And you could just analyze it from a variety of angles just to make sure it looks good. We're going to save. So now let's do the simplest possible setup. Let's just get the fire attached to the player's hand, and then we'll go from there. So if we go back to our third person character blueprint, so not the animation blueprint, but the actual character blueprint. And on our event graph, I'm just going to zoom in, and I'm going to get this working with just hitting the number 1 on our keyboard, but you could use any button you want. So if you right click on the event graph and just type 1, so keyboard event 1. So what do I want to do when I press the 1 on my keyboard? So basically, I just want to spawn the Niagara system for the fire and attach that directly to my player's hand. So from the pressed execution pin here, I could just say spawn Niagara or spawn system attached. And what are we attaching to? So we're attaching it to our mesh. So I can drag in a reference to our mesh, and we're attaching it to a specific point on our mesh. And what was that point? It's hand_r socket. I think this is case sensitive, so make sure you get this exactly. So the attach point name is hand_r socket. The location and the rotation is just attached directly to the socket. All this other stuff we don't need to worry about right now, but let's select our template. So if we go back to the content drawer, let's go back to our content, Niagara, gameplay abilities, fire. So that was torchlight_ns. So torchlight, and there it is. So that's basically it. Let's compile and save. Let's test this out when pressing 1. All right, so here I go. And there's our fire. And it even moves around when I run. It's kind of susceptible to the velocity of things. But we got a couple of problems, right? So hitting 1 again doesn't turn off the fire in any regard, so that's one problem. And then also, we're not moving our hand in any general direction. We're not moving it up. We're not moving it side to side. So it just looks like our player is in flames as I slowly run down the corridor. So how do we fix all that? So let's set up the toggle back and forth first, the ability to turn it on and off. And this is a little bit tricky because it's our third person character blueprint, BP third person character here, that's going to allow us to do the toggle. But it's actually the animation blueprint that we're communicating to because we want it to do an animation, right? So the way I'm going to handle this is I'm actually going to set up a variable on the animation blueprint. And the reason I'm going to do that is because that variable is going to control whether or not our player's arm is animated upwards or really any direction you want to animate it. So to get that communication between our character blueprint and our animation blueprint, we're going to set up what's called a reference because these are two blueprints that are going to be communicating constantly. So every single time we communicate between these two blueprints, I could cast, I could do that casting every single time. But what if we could just cast once, we set up a permanent reference, and then we could reference that every single time going forward. So that's what we're going to do. So if you scroll all the way up to the top, so on begin play, that's when we're going to do the cast. We're going to have that reference past that point, and then those two blueprints can communicate perfectly from that point forward. So if we right click and we say event begin play, and so how do we cast to our animation blueprint? Well, our animation blueprint is connected via the mesh, and then from the mesh, we get the anim instance. Because if you remember, I showed this earlier, if I go over to the mesh, that's where it's attached right here, the anim class. And then from the anim instance, that's exactly where I can cast directly to this blueprint. So I can drag off a pin here and cast to ABP, third person character, and connect this up. And then as ABP third person character, I can right click on this and say promote to variable. And so if the cast succeeds, then it sets this variable right here. And instead of as ABP third person character, I'm just going to rename that as AnimBP reference. And I'm also going to put that under a category of references. And basically that's going to be a category of variables on this blueprint for any other class, any other blueprint that I need to communicate to. So you're going to see the reason that we did that in just a minute. But if we go back over to our animation blueprint, so here is where I'm going to set up a new variable. And the variable is basically going to be right arm holding up. Like, do we want that arm to be held up or not? So under variables here, I'm just going to hit plus, and we're going to call this right arm holding up. And this is from a previous episode, but this activated jump land effects, I'm just going to put this under essential movement data here. All right, so we have our right arm holding up variable. So this is going to drive the animation, but we won't set that up quite yet. Let's compile this. Let's go back to our third person character blueprint. We'll come down, 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 down here. And I'll make some space by moving out the spawn system attached. Now, because we have the reference, we don't need to cast to that animation blueprint. So we can just get a reference. And then from that reference, we can just drag out a pin, right arm, and we can get that variable. And so the reason we're doing this is because if the right arm is being held up, then we want to put it back down. We want to turn off the Niagara system. And if the right arm is down currently, then we want to hold it up. So we could set up a branch and connect that up. So if the right arm holding up is false, that's when we want to spawn the Niagara system here. I'm just going to drag this down. Now, if it's true, what do we want to do? So we want to make this a toggle, right? So we want to turn off the fire if it's true. So how do we then turn off this? So to do that, we need to make this into a variable that we can reference. So I can right click on the return value, promote to variable. So then on that new component, I can just right click, rename. We're going to call this the active Niagara system. And it's possible in the future I might have more than one active Niagara system, but for now we're just going to have one, so that's what we'll name it. So now that we're making a variable for this Niagara system, the second it's spawned, then we can reference it, and then we can basically destroy that Niagara system. So I can drag in a reference, get, and then I can say destroy component. And then I'll connect up our true pin to that. And let me run through the logic here very quickly. So here's what's happening. I press 1, right arm holding up. If it's true, we're going to destroy component. And if false, then we're going to spawn the component. We're going to spawn the Niagara system. But the other thing I need to do here is when it's set to false, I need to switch this to true because otherwise this variable will never change and it'll always be false. So then if I move over to the right-hand side, I can just drag in a reference again. And now we're going to set the right arm holding up. And then this is going to be true, right? And then in this case, I can just copy and paste it up here. In this case, it's going to be false again. And so that should work as a toggle. So at first it's false, it spawns the fire, and then it sets this to true. And then if I hit 1 again, then it's true, and then it destroys the fire and it sets it back to false. So let's compile and save. Let's give this a whirl. All right, 1, there's our fire. 1 again, fire's gone. 1, 1, 1, 1. Cool. All right, so now we get into the complicated part and also the kind of fun part because we could do all sorts of stuff with what we're about to get into. So how do we make the player's arm actually go up when the right arm holding up is true? And so for this, we got to get into some functionality we have not yet covered in this series. So if you go back to your animation blueprint, so if you've been following this series, you're already familiar with the animation blueprint event graph, and we're not going to have to touch the event graph at all today in our animation blueprint. So everything that we're going to do today actually takes place instead in what's called the AnimGraph. So if you double click on that on the left-hand side, so the AnimGraph is what makes the animation blueprint the animation blueprint. It's what brings together all the different pieces of animation to create what's called a final pose or an output pose. And so the primary pieces of that are the animations themselves. But then on top of that, we can manipulate bones. We can do other things like this control rig IK trace stuff. If you noticed our player when he's stepping on stairs, like one foot could be higher up than the other. They're not actually evenly spaced. So that's being controlled by the IK trace here. But back to the AnimGraph here. So it's figuring out our final output pose in every single instant, every single moment of the game. And it's using what are called state machines, which are various collections of animations that represent a particular state. So if I go into main states, for example, so we have this fall loop, right? Because there are different animations that are involved in falling. You have the initial jump, and then you have like, I'm falling, and then you have a land animation. And so then we have a to land, and then a land, and then it goes back to a regular locomotion. All these different nodes, all these different animations and AnimGraphs, they have different logic that connects them. So if something is true, then it goes, so is falling, then it goes into the fall loop, for instance. And we're going to get into all of this in earnest in about 2 episodes, because that's when we're actually importing new animations from outside into our character. But for now, we're going to focus on what animations we need to modify such that the player's arm is going to be extended upwards when that fire is activated. Because I want this ability to be activated when the player is just standing still, but also when they're walking or running, right? So the animations we really need to manipulate are the walking and running, and all of those are under locomotion. Actually, if we go back to the AnimGraph and then we just go to the locomotion state machine here. So this is very simple. We got our idle, and then if the character should move, then it goes to walk run, and then if they should not move, it goes back to idle. So let's start with our idle animation. So we'll go into that node. And this is just playing our idle animation sequence over and over and over. It's set to loop over here, and we see our character just idling by. And so because we're not creating a new animation, we're just modifying an existing animation, what we need to do is make some space here. And we're not actually modifying the animation in the animation itself, because then we'd go into the animation editor and we could do some things there. We're not doing that. what we're doing is when this animation is playing, if something is true, meaning if that right arm holding up variable is true, then we want the arm to actually move up. So in this, we just want to modify the behavior of two bones. Basically, it's our upper arm and then our forearm. And so to modify the behavior of specific bones, we need to drag out from this and we need to say local to component. And it goes right back component to local. And as this stands, if I compile and save, it basically does nothing. So it goes to individual components and then it goes back to local, but nothing happens. And you heard me say we only want to modify two bones. So what I can do is drag out a pin and I could say modify, transform, modify bone. Now, before we do any modification whatsoever, what's actually controlling this modification? It's whether or not this variable is true, right? So in that case, I can just drag in a reference. And normally I would just hook this up here, but the problem is that's a float variable. So we need to change the alpha input type from a float to instead be a bool. And then we can connect this up. So basically, if this variable is true, then we're going to transform modify a specific bone. Right now it says bone none. We haven't chosen what bone we're going to modify. But if we go back into our skeleton here, so remember I was talking about clavicle right, upper arm right. Let me zoom out here so you could see. And I did a lot of experimentation with this. Basically, it's a trial and error. But the only bones we need to modify here are the upper arm and the lower arm. So if we go back to our third-person character animation blueprint, go back to that node. So the bone to modify, we can just scroll down there and under clavicle R, choose upper arm R. Now we could do all sorts of things with this bone. We could physically move the bone to a different location. That's the translation. I could say, well, the arm is actually out here. And that has all sorts of effects of stretching skin. It just looks all sorts of wacky. So I don't recommend doing that. So we're keeping that under ignore. And then scale, same thing. Now you could do some crazy things here. Like you could slowly scale up the bones over time. So the character like morphs and changes into the giant Hulk or something like that. But I don't recommend doing that unless you're experienced with that sort of thing. But the basics today, we're starting with rotation because really that's what's changing. The rotation of the upper arm relative to its parent bone, the clavicle, that's what's moving up. And so if I select that node and then under rotation, we're going to say instead of add to existing, which is whatever the animation's already doing with that bone, we can add some additional rotation to it. But instead of that, I'm just going to say replace existing. And we're going to keep this component space here. Now I had to play with this quite a bit because the Y I think is the upward movement of the arm and the X is this way and then the Z is like the curving inward, kind of like the turning of the arm. And so what we're going to set this to is 90, -20, and then -60 for the Z. And I'm going to drag out, make some more space. I can copy this node, paste it again. I'm going to change this one from upper arm R to lower arm because we also need to modify the lower arm. I need to connect this up because we're modifying two different bones. And then for our right arm holding up variable, I'll connect that to that node as well. Just going to move the positioning here a little bit, put in a reroute. And the rotation here is going to be a little different. So it's going to be -110, -130, and 90. Now you can experiment with changing these values and seeing how that rotates the arm, but I just had to do a lot of trial and error until I got this looking as best I could. So make sure your Boolean is connected up to both nodes, make sure your bones are updated, make sure your rotations have the right values, and then if all that looks good, let's compile and save. So all this is flowing through, looking good. Let's test this out. All right, moment of truth. There we go, and there's our fire coming out of the hand. And then if I want to disable it, one again, and it's disabled. But we've got a few different issues here. So one seems to be, it seems to be switching from one to the other instantaneously, which is not too natural, right? Maybe a robot, even a robot can't move that fast. And then the other is that the positioning of the flame's a little bit off. So let's solve both of these. So regarding the positioning of the flame, so what I'm going to do there is I'm going to go back into the skeleton. I'll come down to the socket. So we find our hand, our socket there. And we just got to move over into position. And the reason that's happening is I need to place it kind of in the middle of the hand. So this is really up to you, but I'm going to actually place it like physically in the middle of the hand. If I were making a game where the player would have like a gun, sword, etc., then I would probably place it where I just did, like a little bit out here. But because I'm not doing that, I haven't really revealed the full extent of what we're doing in this game, I'm going to place the socket kind of right square in the middle of the hand. The power is going to originate right in his hand. And to fix the other problem, which is like the instantaneous hand raise, so how do we give that a little bit of a delay? So if you go back into your animation blueprint, back into these two nodes, on the right hand side under details, if you expand blend settings, we have a blend in time and a blend out time. So this is how long it takes for this variable to like turn on the effect. And so instead of being instantaneous, I'm going to make this 0.3 seconds. So a little bit less than a third of a second. And the way I got this is I basically tried out different settings, but you got to think, like, how long realistically does it take you to raise your arm? Even if you're raising it fast, it's probably about a third of a second. Compile and save. So let's try out these two things. So now we're ready. And the fire is still a little bit staggered off. But we look at the hand and it looks like the hand raises and lowers a little bit more naturally, right? So the last thing I did from a positioning standpoint, if I go to the third person character blueprint again, so instead of putting the location just at 0, 0, 0, I just made the Z -20, and that lowered the effect a little bit closer, so into the player's hand instead of above it. And so now, yep, so now the fire is basically in the player's hand there. It's originating from the hand. But the problem remains that when I'm running, yeah, his hand's just all over the place. He's not really holding the fire out in any regards. Now, if you like that effect, that's pretty cool, like running in and through the fire, and you can keep it just as is. But I would prefer that he maybe runs with his hand out a little bit, kind of like holding up a torch. And so if we go back to our third person character animation blueprint, so we already modified the idle animation sequence, but we also need to modify, if we go back to locomotion here, our walk run sequence. So back in the idle, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy all of these. So just highlight, Control C, and then we'll go into the walk run and we'll do the same kind of thing. So I'll split this up and I'll paste it in and move it out a little bit further and then connect these up. So again, I tested this out, and if you're running with it kind of straight in your face, it looks like the fire's blowing in his face. Not a realistic thing. So I just moved his arm out a little bit. So the rotation here, instead of -20, this is going to be 10, and instead of -60, this is going to be -30. And for our lower arm, remaining exactly the same. So compile and save. Let's do one last test. All right, I activate the fire. I'm running. Yep, he's still holding it, and it's holding kind of directly to the right of his head. And then I can deactivate while walking. I also thought about setting this for other animations like jumping, but it seemed to me to be totally normal to keep his hands kind of doing what they're doing, even if he's got a fire burning on the side of his body there. But there's one thing about it that I kind of don't like, which is the fire seems to light instantly, automatically, the second he moves up his hand. And I think it should take a little bit of time. So let's set up a delay there. So back in our third person character blueprint, so over here, we're going to run into some trouble with the delay. So I want to show you how to solve that. But first I'm going to show you the problem. So let's do a delay and we'll wait 0.2 seconds before the effect. Compile and save. We'll test this out. So there are a couple problems. So I hit one, and it takes 0.2 seconds before the hand actually raises, so it doesn't solve the problem. We need to raise the hand before we actually play the effect. So to do that, I basically need to reorganize this. I need to set this variable to be true before the delay. So all of this stuff, I need to drag this out. And then for this variable, I need to set that to be true first, because that's what controls the hand actually moving up. Compile, save, we'll test it again. So at first glance, that looks pretty good, right? So I lower the hand, I raise the hand, I lower the hand, I raise the hand. The problem is if you spam one over and over and over again. So if I do, so then I can't even turn it off anymore. And then I also get this error saying that Niagara component 2 is not valid. And the reason that's occurring is because if I spam it repeatedly, what happens is this gets set to true and the Niagara system never spawns, and it's trying to destroy something that never spawned. So what I'm going to set, instead of a regular delay, we're going to do a different kind of delay here, which is called a retriggerable delay. And the retriggerable delay, it basically works to prevent this sort of thing, because if the same path is taken within the 0.2 seconds, it basically resets the timer. So it sets it back to 0.2 seconds. But the other thing I found that always ensures that this active Niagara system is never attempted to be destroyed if it doesn't even exist is that we can change our branch logic here. So instead of assessing this variable, what we're going to assess is whether that active system is actually active. Get active Niagara system, and we can say if it's valid, so function is valid, and if it is valid, meaning this system exists, then do this, and only attempt to destroy it if that indeed exists. But if not, then keep going down this route. So in combination with that retriggerable delay, what's going to happen is nothing, because here's what will happen. So you spam one over and over and over. It starts the animation up, and then it starts going here, but it never gets there because every single time you spam this and it hits this, it's saying false because there's no component to destroy yet. And so it keeps going, and then it keeps re-triggering this, and the thing never spawns. So you're basically preventing the player from spamming an ability. Compile, save, we'll test this out one last time. All right, moment of truth. So turns off, turns on, turns off, turns on. But if I spam it, the arm is raised, but no ability. Only when I stop spamming it does it turn on. So there are 4 final issues with this, 3 of which I know how to solve, but 1 I do not. And for that one, I am basically going to ask the audience if anyone out there has any ideas. But let's cover first the ones I do know how to solve. And the first, we're not going to solve this episode, but we are in the next episode. And that is the fact that the player's hand can go straight through the pillar there. And the solution to that is something called inverse kinematics, or IK for short. And what inverse kinematics is it's basically animation based on the object that's being pushed up against instead of the character themselves. But there's 2 other problems going on here, and you might have noticed it. So the hand's kind of shining through the fire at certain times, which is really an effect I don't like. And then also there's no collision on the fire. So you see the fire actually like passing through the pillar there, and then it comes out the other side. Obviously that's unrealistic. Now that's partially going to be solved with the inverse kinematics solution, but only partially because the player's hand could still be on the side of the pillar like it is here, and then the fire is still going through the pillar. So the way we solve those 2 problems, one with the hand showing through the fire and then the other with the fire particles just going straight through whatever object they're touching, is we need to activate collision on the system. So if you go back to your content drawer, if you go into Niagara gameplay abilities, wherever you save that system, we're going to go back into that. So there's not that much documentation on this, but I did find just enough to solve the issue. So if we go into emitter summary here in the second emitter, there's a whole section on collisions right down here. You might need to scroll down a little to see it. And right now, use depth map collisions is set to checked. I'm not sure why that's not working in my world. So if anyone has any ideas on how to make depth map collisions work, I'd be all ears. But what I did find is if instead we use particle collisions, so I'm going to check that here, and then I'm going to uncheck use depth map collisions and open boundary up. And I know I'm kind of blocking the view here, so let me make this a smaller window so you could see it. So if you come down after you check use particle collisions and uncheck those other 2, here we've got to put in an emitter name. And all I did is I put in the same name as our emitter up here. It's got to be verbatim. So grid 2D, I don't know if it's case sensitive or not, but I'm just making sure I get all the capitalization right. And then tab, and then it's working. So I can hit save, and let's just try that out. So now, as I'm spinning around, I'm not seeing the player's hand anywhere through the fire. So we're not having that weird effect, which I really, really like, obviously. And then if I hold the hand up next to the pillar, so right next to the pillar, you won't see the fire kind of going through the pillar and coming out the other side. It still kind of brushes up against the pillar, you see that, but it's not actually going through and coming out the other side. It seems a lot more accurate to me that there's actually a pillar there that the fire is colliding against. And we'll solve the IK problem next episode. One thing I did notice is that turning on this kind of collision, it lowered my frame rate by about 3 to 4 FPS. Nothing too significant, but something to keep in mind. Now the last problem that I don't know how to solve that you might have noticed already is that regardless of how far back our scene goes, it's still lit in the same way. So that's a really long tunnel there. It's still completely lit up by the fire in the distance. And if I go very close instead, it's still lit up just about the same. So I've been thinking about this, and honestly, I might just consider this a feature of the game I'm looking to make rather than a bug. Because in effect, it means that this torchlight acts like a flashlight because it shines into the distance. Now this is some speculation on my part, but I think the problem has to do with the fact that the particles don't know how far in the distance the meshes, the scenery in the background actually is, because it's just seeing the stuff on the screen in a 2D space. I don't think it's communicating back to the CPU to see that. But if someone has a solution to this, or if at least you know the cause, I'd be really grateful to know more. So if you could post in the comments below, that would be awesome. For sticking around to the end of the episode, I just wanted to give you guys one last bonus effect. So if you go back into your emitter, and I found this when I was just playing with it, but it's a pretty neat effect. So if we turn on the sprite renderer under source particles here, and save, and now let's play. I'm calling this the Molten Fire effect because check it out. If I hit 1, it's almost like I got lava burning in the palm of my hand. I could almost envision the player as like this energy being kind of reaching through like a metal door and just melting it with his bare hand. It's something I might actually use in my game, but I figured I'd show it to you. So that concludes today's episode, guys, and I hope to see you in the next one.